Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Marvit Ahananu, a project manager with an architecture background. Today we'll be discussing what it actually takes to deliver architecture projects from design to completion, the trends shaping the industry right now, career growth, and how students can break into this field. Marvit, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Lorenzo.
Now, Marvit, can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into architecture and project management?
Well, about my background, I started off in architecture with a Bachelor of Science in Architecture and completed my Master of Architecture at the University of Calgary. For that program, I was leveraging, first of all, the strength in art. So I tend to have a bit of an art background as well as architecture. I just found myself being on the creative side. I think architecture was a very good match or a good fit based off of that already existing skill and interest. Just having that drive to want to be able to create something and create something that is good for society and humanity. So I think that is definitely something that pulled me into that field. And when it came to project management, because when you design something, it somehow has to be managed to become a reality. So I think that's when project management came into the picture. I did my project management license after my graduation from architecture.
So you own your own architecture firm. How long has it been since you've started that?
It's been registered for over a year ago now, but in terms of carrying out work, supporting projects, I would say that it's been on for over 2 years now.
Awesome. Okay. So you've been doing some projects beforehand, then finally there was a point where you're like, I need to go get this registered. I'm onto something. Let's go grow this.
That's right.
Awesome. Okay. And then becoming an architect, what are the steps needed beforehand? What is the schooling or test requirements to actually go and become an architect and start your own architecture business?
In terms of working towards architecture practice, for me right now, it's more of architecture design, and I'm still working my way towards being an architect. There are requirements as to education and professional experience that is required as well towards working your way to become an architect. You definitely require a background in architecture in terms of education, having your degree requirements, and then working your way towards the internship process to be able to become an architect.
Awesome. Okay. So you go get your degree in architecture and then you start doing your internships. Now, is there like a final license or a final examination that's needed to be official, or is it just a degree?
So after the work experience, I understand that it takes about 2 to 5 years. Once you meet that requirement, then you take the professional exams, and then once you pass that, you become an architect. Through that process, you pass the exam and then you get registered, then you become an architect.
Okay. Now, for your business, doing the architecture firm, what kind of projects are you currently working on?
So for myself, I'm doing more of renovation space for interiors, renovation design spaces, as well as gallery spaces as well. So in terms of my practice, is more of architecture design. So not as an architect and fully, but an architecture designer and being able to manage the project to make sure that it meets the goals that it was set for.
So I know you have a very artistic side, very good with the designs. So is it like you're in charge of all of the design aspects and then there's someone that's responsible for kind of the structural aspects of the building, or you do both structural and design?
So while you're working your way towards your architecture school, you're definitely exposed to structural courses and structural education, which you can leverage on during your design. However, in practice, there are certain situations where you definitely require an external or an expert in structure and engineering if we're required to be able to support the design process for that project. So it depends on the scale of the project that you would then bring on board an engineer or a structural engineer. And I understand that after certain floor levels, you definitely require a structural engineer to be part of that project.
Yeah, so they're going to have their own specializations and together that's how that building will be formed. It's not just one architect that's going to be working on a million different things. It's the architect who's working in collaboration with a structural engineer who's working with all sorts of other engineers so that they can make sure that as beautiful as the designs are, that these things are feasible and can be safely constructed. They're going to have their own specializations, and together that's how that building will be formed. Now, I'm curious, so for your practice, how long does a typical project take? Is it like you would be working on one project for a year, multiple years? Is it a couple months? What does that kind of timeline look like?
So when it comes to timeline projects, different projects have different timelines. Depends on the complexity of the project. For a very simple project, it could take as much as 3 months to a year and a half. And as the project increases in complexity, also the time required for its completion increases as well. Sometimes 5 years, 10 years, depends on the requirements of the project and the complexity. Another thing is projects sometimes have phases. So that as well influences the timeline of a project. A project is like a machine of moving parts, and being able to coordinate it, it's definitely a very wonderful skill to have.
I think that's a great point, talking about the phases. For the viewers that aren't familiar with how the phases work, can you explain how the design process works in those phases and what that means?
Yes, for sure. Most projects usually start with a preliminary phase where you're gathering the right information as to how the project should be going or the direction of that project. And once you're done with that preliminary phase, you go into the conceptual design of how you want that project to look like or how that project is supposed to look like. And then we have the executionary phase where you then come up with an actual design and then construction documentation. And then following that process, you get all the required documentation that's required for a project.
So say I were the developer and I had a plot of land that I was looking to collaborate with you and make a project. It's not like you would have all of the designs done kind of in full with all the structural plans, because the city can quickly say, okay, well, we're not going to permit it. So correct me if I'm wrong, like when you're doing the phases, that you would have kind of like a preliminary, you have all your sketches, the design, so that when you're pitching to the city, they have an idea of what it looks like and the sizes. But as you get approvals from the city and as they greenlight different phases, then you can elaborate more on your designs where the details become more solidified. It's more, you figure out more the structural side kind of as you get the approvals, but you don't want that bulk 100% finished because a city can easily say no and then you're stuck with a project you can't build. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. However, I do believe that before even sending it to the city, that documentation has to be done. Sometimes the construction drawings, you have to send it to make sure that the building code is being adhered to during that phase, which is what these are things that definitely the city would look into to make sure that it's in line with the standards that project is supposed to be developed in. And then if it doesn't meet that requirement and a couple of other requirements that the city requires, it could be energy, a couple of other requirements there that should be looked into to make sure that it's properly documented and
Mm.
shown that before it gets that approval. So I think that documentation phase definitely comes in before submitting for a permit.
So when you're sending it off, it's more than just the visual representation. There's still a bare minimum kind of structural side that's kind of going through the code. So it doesn't mean a full design ready from the get-go, but there is still a minimum kind of standard that is needed to present.
I think one thing that's important at this phase is that each city has their own guidelines, has their own documentations that are required to be able to get those building permits. So once it's at that stage where you need to get the permit, you have to make sure that you are going through those standards to ensure that you're meeting those requirements that's on the permit documentation specifications that needs to be sent. There are situations where you need to send all those documentations before it gets approved, like the construction drawings, how it's supposed to be done, methodology, so that it is in line with the city requirements and it's based off of what they require. So it's what they are requiring according to their own standard that you work with.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's so true. It's gonna definitely depend on your city, your region, the guidelines that work because it's not gonna be the same across all of them. There's the general concept, but the specific details, those are gonna vary. Now, just talking about this, as we're talking about the phases, when you're making that design, you're obviously getting lots of feedback from the city and what they're wanting to have built, and you're also getting feedback from the developer. So, how many times do you think you were revising and editing your initial design across that phase where you finally have your finished product?
I was made to understand during my master's that design is usually a very iterative process, meaning that sometimes when you come up with a design, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the final design for that project. It also means that as you get feedback, it will be iterated to make sure that those feedbacks are being incorporated into the design. And I've come to realize as well as a designer that the design process is not a one-man thing. It's more of having stakeholders' interests that are in that project and based off of your stakeholders and the comments that they have. And I think that's where project management comes in as well, being able to manage those various interests and seeing how you can fuse it together in the design and being able to incorporate it in a way that is unified and is responding to various objectives or various interests in that project. I think it's not necessarily a full stop, but it's an iterative process and depends on, and that's why I think the preliminary phase is very important because you're able to gather the right information as much as you gather those information and make sure that it's properly captured even from the get-go. I think with that, you might not exactly get a lot of changes later on because you have incorporated the stakeholders at the early stage so that they are all captured there. And then you build off of that. By doing so and incorporating the right stakeholders on your project from the early start of the project, you're able to minimize huge changes or alterations later along the line of the project.
Those are really good point. It's that when you're making those designs, always expecting that there's going to be lots of feedback and lots of changes along the way. But the best way that you can manage that is when you're in the early phases, that you're thinking and considering all those stakeholders so that you're not going to have large changes that could have been easily prevented. So you're doing what you can to think of everyone from the beginning. So that way things are going to naturally evolve over the timeline, but you're not going to be restarting from the beginning because you didn't take that into consideration. Now, that's such a great topic, like kind of diving more into the stakeholders. How do you know what the stakeholders want? Like, how do you figure out what they're looking for so you can integrate that into your designs?
I think from the first stage of a design process or any project, it is important to carefully identify who the stakeholders of that project, who the stakeholders are going to be. Define it as anyone that's going to be impacted by a project, positively or negatively, that's your stakeholder. The client obviously is going to be impacted by the project. The users are going to be impacted by the project. And so who are you designing for? Who is supporting this project? I think putting them from the get-go, ensuring that they are carried along from early start. I think that's important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that first step being in order to appeal to people, you need to know who they are firstly. So making that document, understanding and labeling all of your stakeholders. And like you're saying, you had a good point of what is the contact method that they would prefer? Not everyone, because you're going to need to ask them questions, gather their feedback and opinion so that you can take it into consideration. But not everyone wants to be contacted the same way. I'm kind of curious on this. What is the main way? Is there a typical way that stakeholders are liking to be engaged? Are these phone calls, Zoom, in person? Like, is there an average or is it different every time?
I would say that just as everyone is different, everyone may prefer a different means of communication. So it's important as diligent professional to be able to find out what frequency that they would like to be communicated, what medium do they would like to be communicated, just to make sure that you capture those interests as well as you execute your project and make sure that those interests are being respected and taken through the project.
Yeah, okay. It's always going to vary. People
Yes.
have different preferences. Now, is this you, the architect, that goes out and communicates with these stakeholders and learns from them? Is there someone else who's actually in charge of kind of this process?
So I would say that's the project manager that would be leading that. That's one of the roles of the project manager. They do stakeholder management. They also do communication management. So they capture all these various aspects as well. And beyond that, there's a couple of other things that they also manage as well. They manage entirely the project to make sure that every key person, every contributor on the project is doing their contributions in a way that is working towards the progress of the project.
I can totally get that. And obviously, you are in the kind of unique scenario where you have that experience in project management, you have your certifications in project management, but you're also on the architecture side. Although, in general, for other architects, it's not going to be them going out and communicating with these stakeholders. The project manager is going to handle that, relay all the information, and the architects will kind of be able to make those designs. You obviously have the best of both and handle those. So when you have different opinions from different stakeholders where maybe some people are in favor of a project and some are not, is it that you pick a side? Do you find somewhere in the middle? How do you make sure that everyone feels heard?
Two things that come to mind. The first thing is community engagement by engaging with the community that that project is going to be taking place in and communicating professionally the project goals and various aspects of the project. Another thing I would say is that for any project, there are times where it doesn't necessarily go linear, but being able to have contingency plans as well when executing a project, manage various interests together. Like, for example, one person might want A, another person might want B, but being able to have a collective vision, communicating what the project goal is, maintaining the project goal. You don't necessarily have to pick sides when executing projects because I think it's important that they all feel heard. It's like a skill. You have to be able to understand people. You have to be able to work with people. You have to be able to be in a way that you can meet project goals and where everyone's voice is heard in that project and also while maintaining the goal of the project. So I wouldn't necessarily say picking sides because it can be dicey and it can come back at you.
So it's never 100% on one side or the other. It's always somewhere in between. Architects become a master of compromise where you're trying to fit what the city is looking for, all these stakeholders, the developers, and architects just have that skill where they're able to find that ground where it works for everyone. That makes
Yes,
sense.
maintaining objectivity and maintaining the project goals and working towards that for sure.
And it's never a good idea to ignore stakeholders because you're just going to deal with a lot of issues with the city. You're going to get a lot of pushback from the community, and the most successful projects are always the ones that take those into consideration. So it's definitely not something to miss out on. Okay. In terms of architects, I think personally, the first thing I think of when I'm thinking of architecture is designing new buildings and everything new construction. And obviously, that's a big part of architects' work as well. But another part is renovation. And as you were saying earlier, you're currently working on a renovation project now. Is it 50-50? Do architects specialize in renovations or we're only in new construction? Or would an architect kind of deal with both sides?
An architect deals with both sides and more because architecture is beyond brick and mortar. There's a whole lot that can be done through architecture, from engineering spaces for humans and outdoor spaces as well, new builds, renovation. There's the digital world as well. There's a whole lot that an architect can do to make sure that we are all working towards a common goal of bettering the society.
So you're not going to just do one thing. Architects are able to handle both sides. You're dealing with renovations, you're dealing with the new construction. Now, when you're doing these designs, I know the old school was pencil and paper and you go and you draw everything by hand. Now technology has evolved rapidly. Is it all computers now? Is it still by hand? Is it a mixture?
So for me, because I'm also an artist, I like to draw. I was 10 years old, so I like drawing. I usually start off by drawing. And once I'm drawing, it's also helping me engage my senses as well more. So it always gets you in that space of using various senses to craft or create something. So I would draw first and then translate that into my computer and build off of that.
That makes a lot of sense. I think me as well. Like I find it easier to be creative with your hands, everything just kind of flows nicely. And then once you start to get that picture, you start to get that idea, then you can put it in the computer. And when you get feedback where you have a 6-inch setback, well, then you can do it on the computer. But to get the overall concept for you, the paper is where that begins. Now, for the final question, for those young architecture students who are trying to plan their career, one pathway is going the employment route, working for a architecture firm. Another route could be starting their own architecture firm. So for those students that are on that fence between go be employed or go start your own firm, do you have any kind of advice or questions that they should ask themselves so that they can pick the right way?
But the thing is that in architecture practice, before you start your own firm, you have to go through the process of learning and working for someone. And if you want to be an architect, you have to go through the path of licensing and getting your license, and then you become an architect. And then you can start an architecture firm as an architect. And then there are situations when you want to just design architecture, but not necessarily going through that licensing. And then those, in that regard, you can do architecture designs. But
Mm-hmm.
with that path, there's a threshold as to how much you can do within that space to be able to go on without the licensure requirements. And various provinces have various regulations to that. Another thing is there's this concept of an architect as an entrepreneur, where we have an architecture designer. There are times where someone with a background in architecture doesn't want to go into these spaces, but they just want to design something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be brick and mortar. Maybe they want to go into VR. They don't need that licensing thing because they're not building those structures in place, right? They can decide to go into various other aspects that have backgrounds in architecture and build off of that. And they can leverage their entrepreneurial skills through that process. As an entrepreneur, it doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, I'm working as a licensed architect doing this. It's just I have my education and maybe I want to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, very true. You don't need to be a licensed architect to go be the entrepreneur. If you have that entrepreneurial bug and you're very interested in architecture, like you're saying, there's other things that you can do with the VR where you're making the architecture for the virtual headset. Is that you can go be an entrepreneur related to architect without being a fully licensed. So there's plenty of things to see. Firstly, you need to know, are you going to get your full license? And before you run your own business, getting a little employee time, some exposure, some learning, and then you can go and start your own company. So Marvit, thank you for taking the time to share your experience and insights with us today. Hopefully this conversation gave viewers a clearer picture of what the role looks like, the skills that are needed for succeeding, and whether it's a path worth pursuing. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this interview and want to learn more about the careers in real estate, architecture, and construction, be sure to subscribe. I'll be coming out with new videos every week. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.